Before we start, it's a good idea to go to bed and relax. I also want to ask you to subscribe to my channel, like it and write in the comments where you are from and what time it is. Using the link in the description you can support me. Thank you. Sweet dreams. What if I told you that even the strongest warriors of today wouldn't survive a single day in medieval Scandinavia? This story will take you into a world where cold wasn't weather, it was a hunter, where hunger ruled every home, and where raids from rival tribes could erase an entire village before sunrise. Across 33 parts, you'll follow the brutal rhythm of daily life, understand how people survived the unsurvivable, and discover why you'd never last even 24 hours in that unforgiving land. The first thing you would feel in medieval Scandinavia is not fear, not hunger, not danger, but cold so sharp it feels alive. The kind of cold that does not simply surround you, it presses into your bones, fills your lungs like broken glass, and waits for the moment your strength slips. Modern clothing would fail within hours. Medieval people survived only because they understood a truth you don't: the cold was a predator, and every day was a new hunt. When dawn came, if the sky wasn't smothered by storm clouds, villagers rose slowly from beneath layers of animal hides. Not because they were lazy, but because moving too quickly could kill you. If you stood up too fast, warm air escaped your bedding, your wet breath turned to needles in the air, and the shock alone could trigger shivering so intense it drained your energy reserves for the entire day. People learned to rise like old trees waking after winter, slowly, deliberately, guarding every bit of warmth. Inside the longhouse, heat was precious. Only a few families had enough firewood to last the winter. Most survived by burning bones, driftwood, or even dried seaweed, none of which produced enough heat to keep the bitter frost outside. The longhouse walls were insulated with moss, tar, and whatever scraps were available, but the wind still pierced through. Children slept so close together it was impossible to know where one ended and the next began. Infants were kept alive by being wrapped against their mother's bare skin, the only reliable heater nature provided. Outside, the temperature could fall below what your body is capable of withstanding. Imagine stepping out of the longhouse in the early morning darkness, snow crunches underfoot like snapping wood, your eyelashes immediately freeze together, and the air bites through your nostrils so harshly you taste blood. You'd last maybe 3 minutes before your fingers began to stiffen, 10 before numbness spread like ink beneath your skin, and 30 before frostbite sank its teeth in. But the Scandinavians? They walked into that deathly cold as if greeting an old friend. They had no choice. Survival demanded movement. Animals needed feeding, tools needed repairing, and fishing lines had to be checked every morning, no matter the weather. A single missed day could mean starvation later. Even the strongest warriors feared the winter winds. Men who survived battles, raids, and shipwrecks sometimes died within sight of their homes, collapsing into the snow just meters from safety. You might imagine Vikings as tireless soldiers, but the truth is simpler and harsher: they were people who learned to live with pain the way you live with a warm blanket. And yet, despite all this, the cold was only one threat among many. Hunger lurked behind every corner. Crops failed often. Salted fish spoiled. Smokehouses sometimes froze over. Every winter, the weakest members of the household simply disappeared. Some died quietly in their sleep, others chose to leave the longhouse during the night, walking into the snow so the family would not have to feed one more mouth. This was not a world where you hoped for a better tomorrow. It was a world where you hoped to wake up at all. If the cold was a hunter, then hunger was the king that ruled medieval Scandinavia. You might imagine endless feasts of roasted meat, overflowing drinking horns, and tables covered with bread and cheese, the images you've seen in films. The truth was far bleaker. Most people lived on the edge of starvation, and every winter felt like a countdown to death. Food was not just scarce, it was unpredictable. A single storm could wipe out fishing boats. A failed harvest could doom an entire village. When the snow came early, it sealed the earth like iron, locking away everything that might have grown or crawled beneath it. Even the forests, which today might seem full of life, were nearly empty during winter. Animals fled, burrowed, or died. Hunters who ventured too far risked freezing, breaking through river ice, or wandering into the territory of rival clans. Inside the longhouse, the smell of hunger filled the air. Not the smell of rotting food or cooked meals, but the sharp, metallic scent of empty stomachs. People learned to work on minimal energy, weaving, carving, repairing nets, sharpening axes, all while fighting dizziness from lack of food. Children cried at night not because they were frightened, but because hunger gnawed at them like a living thing. Meals were tiny and spaced far apart. A bowl of thin fish broth in the morning, maybe a crust of barley bread at midday, and dried fish or smoked lamb shavings at night, if you were lucky. And these weren't meals designed to satisfy, they were rations meant to delay death. Everyone ate slowly, savoring the illusion of fullness. Even the wealthier households only occasionally enjoyed fresh meat, and when they did, every part of the animal was used: bone marrow, skin, organs, even hooves boiled into jelly. During the harshest months, families practiced quiet, unspoken rationing. Mothers reduced their own portions so children could survive. Elders refused food altogether. A grandmother might push her share away and smile gently, claiming she wasn't hungry, even though everyone knew the truth: someone had to ease the burden. And then there were the winters when famine hit, real famine. The kind where bodies grew light and brittle, where fingers trembled, and where people walked slower every day because starvation made their bones feel hollow. In those winters, rules loosened. Dogs disappeared. Leather was boiled into something edible. Moss scraped off roofs became a last resort. People whispered about neighbors who vanished. No one asked questions. But hunger did something else, something you'd struggle to understand. It created unity. Families ate together from one pot, not because it was practical, but because it was a ritual of survival. Sharing warmth and food was an act of defiance against the world outside. Every bite was a victory. Yet hunger was only part of the nightmare. While the villagers battled cold and starvation, another danger waited beyond the tree line, one human, unpredictable, and merciless. Because in medieval Scandinavia, you didn't just fear the winter. You feared your neighbors. In medieval Scandinavia, danger didn't always come from the cold or from hunger. Sometimes, it came from the people living just a few fjords away. Raids were not heroic adventures, they were simple, brutal mathematics: take or starve. And if your village had something that others needed, then whether you lived or died depended on how quickly you could gather your weapons, protect your livestock, and pray the walls of the longhouse held. Unlike the massive Viking raids romanticized today, most conflicts were small and terrifyingly personal. These were not armies, these were groups of 10, 20, maybe 30 desperate men who had lost too many animals to wolves, too many children to sickness, and too much hope to winter. When hunger pressed hard enough, killing strangers was easier than burying your own family. Imagine waking up to the sound of distant horns echoing through the forest. They weren't musical, they were warnings. A heartbeat later, you'd hear the barking of dogs, the crunch of feet on snow, and the high, sharp screams of women gathering children into the darkest corners of the longhouse. Everything moved fast. Men reached for axes, spears, and battered wooden shields. The fire was smothered immediately, light was a target, heat was a beacon. Silence became your only defense. Raids didn't begin with speeches. There were no negotiations, no polite threats. They started with fire, a torch thrown onto the thatched roof, a burning arrow shot into a haystack, or embers scattered around the stable. Raiders didn't need to kill you outright, smoke and chaos did the work for them. While villagers scrambled to extinguish flames, attackers rushed in through the weak points, side doors, animal pens, storage huts. And if you think you could hide, think again. Every village knew the other village's hiding spots. Caves, tree hollows, abandoned boats, even burial mounds, all were searched routinely during raiding seasons. Children were sometimes hidden in barrels or beneath the flooring planks, but even then, the risk was enormous. Raiders were not merciful. Anyone found was either taken as a servant or left to die in the snow. But raids weren't always one-sided. Scandinavian communities trained from childhood to defend themselves. Even a starving villager knew how to swing an axe with deadly precision. Women fought too, not in stories, but in real life. They wielded knives, stones, and whatever could fracture a raider's skull. A longhouse under attack was a storm of fury and survival instinct. When raiders failed, they retreated swiftly, disappearing into the forest before reinforcements arrived. But when they succeeded, the aftermath was horrifyingly quiet. Burned timber cracked softly in the wind. Animals lay gutted or stolen. Snow was stained with blood that froze into dark patches. Survivors gathered in silence because grief had to wait. First, they had to put out fires, salvage tools, and regroup. Only later, when the night fell again, did they allow themselves to cry. Here's the truth you must understand: violence was woven into the fabric of life. People did not raid because they were evil, they raided because the environment itself forced them to. Cold, hunger, disease, and scarcity sharpened human instincts to a lethal edge. Every winter, you feared the storms. Every spring, you feared the raids. There was no safe season. And this constant tension, the knowledge that death could come quietly or violently, shaped the mindset of every Scandinavian villager from the day they were born. At first glance, a Scandinavian longhouse might seem like a warm refuge, a wooden sanctuary glowing with firelight, filled with families huddled close. But in reality, the longhouse was both your only shelter and your greatest vulnerability. It protected you from the cold, yes, but it also turned you into an easy target for fire, disease, and enemies who knew exactly where you slept. A longhouse was typically built low and narrow, with thick timber walls and a roof of turf or thatch. Moss and tar sealed the cracks, but not well enough to keep out the wind. Inside, smoke from the central fire pit drifted toward the rafters, but since chimneys didn't exist, the air remained hazy. Everything, clothing, bedding, hair, even food, smelled faintly of wood smoke. It coated your lungs, stung your eyes, and left children coughing through winter nights. And yet, this smoky interior was still safer than stepping outside. Families slept on raised wooden platforms covered with straw, fur, and woven blankets. These sleeping areas weren't private, they were arranged side by side like slots in a ship. You could hear every breath of your neighbors, every groan, whisper, and turn of the body. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space didn't exist. Your life was shared, your warmth, your secrets, your fears. But the longhouse had a darker side. It trapped heat, but it also trapped disease. In winter, the doors stayed shut for days at a time. Dozens of people, siblings, cousins, grandparents, farmhands, breathed the same stale air. If one person fell sick, everyone did. A cough spread through the longhouse faster than smoke. Fevers passed from family to family like a curse. Infants were the first to suffer. The old were the first to die. No doctor came to help, no herbs could stop a spreading infection. Families learned to listen to the sounds of illness. A dry cough meant danger. A rattling chest meant a long night ahead. A quiet child, the worst sign of all. But the longhouse didn't only trap disease. It trapped fear. During raids, the longhouse became a fortress, but also a coffin. When attackers approached, families barricaded the doors with wooden beams, benches, and anything heavy enough to slow intruders. Children curled behind storage chests. Women clutched knives, axes, or sharpened bone tools. Men stood near the entrance, ready to push back raiders or die doing so. The walls that protected you from wind could be set ablaze in seconds. Smoke killed faster than blades. When flames spread across the dry thatch roof, villagers had only minutes to react. Sometimes families broke through the back wall to escape, kicking out planks and crawling into the snow. Other times, there was no escape at all. Yet for all its dangers, the longhouse was the beating heart of Scandinavian life. It was a place of stories, songs, rituals, and rare moments of warmth. Children learned to walk on its floors. Couples whispered together on winter nights. Feasts, when they happened, filled the longhouse with laughter and drums. But don't mistake those moments for comfort. Even in peace, life inside the longhouse demanded constant work. Someone had to maintain the fire, watch the livestock, repair tools, spin wool, mend fishing nets, and prepare whatever food was available. Idleness meant death. The longhouse kept families alive, barely. It shielded them from storms, gave structure to their days, and allowed communities to survive through the longest winters. But when you lived inside it, you always knew one thing. This place protects you, until the moment it doesn't. If you think people in medieval Scandinavia lived slowly, spending their days strolling through forests or sharpening axes by the fire, you're imagining a fantasy. In reality, every single day was a battle against exhaustion, and there was no such thing as a day off. Rest was a luxury reserved only for the dead. From the moment the faintest gray light seeped through the cracks of the longhouse roof, the entire household rose like a machine built from muscle and habit. Children woke first, not because they wanted to, but because they were shaken awake. Chores didn't wait. Sleep was never enough. Even in winter, when dawn arrived late, work began in darkness. The fire needed tending before frost crept across the inside walls. Livestock had to be checked, not fed generously, but kept alive with scraps, frozen hay, or dried seaweed. A single dead goat or cow could mean a family went hungry for weeks. Men performed the hardest physical labor, chopping wood, hauling water from half-frozen streams, repairing fences and fishing equipment, digging out snowed-in storage pits, or breaking ice so animals could drink. Modern tools would have made this easier. Medieval Scandinavians had nothing of the sort. Their axes dulled quickly, their saws broke, and their rope frayed. Every chore took twice as long under the weight of cold and hunger. Women, meanwhile, carried the burden of keeping the household running, a task far more demanding than outsiders assume. They spun wool until their fingers cracked, wove cloth that protected against the cold, preserved fish in salt, boiled bones for broth, scraped hides for clothing, patched every torn garment, and kept children alive with whatever food could be found. Their work required endurance, strength, and relentless focus. But the most brutal part of the day came with the chores that required leaving the relative warmth of the longhouse. Gathering firewood meant walking into forests where wolves hunted, where snow could collapse unexpectedly, and where one misstep might break a leg and doom a life. Collecting water meant kneeling beside icy rivers, hands turning stiff and purple within seconds. Fishing required standing on slippery rocks, breathing air so cold the inside of your nose burned. And all of this had to be done every day, without fail. If someone got sick, the chores didn't stop. If someone was injured, they worked anyway, or the rest of the family suffered. A broken foot meant you crawled instead of walked. A deep cut meant you wrapped it in wool and kept going. There was no alternative. Even children, as young as 4 or 5, were expected to contribute. Their tiny hands stuffed gaps in the walls with moss, carried small bundles of firewood, sorted fish bones for needles, or followed older siblings into the forest to gather bark, branches, and berries. Childhood was not a gentle phase of life, it was the first stage of survival training. By midday, everyone was already exhausted. But there was no lunch break, no warm meal waiting. People ate when the work allowed it, often standing, chewing silently, praying the small ration gave enough strength to finish the day. And even then, hunger remained. The body never truly felt full. As evening fell, more chores waited, repairing tools, caring for the elderly, checking the animals again, securing the doors against wolves or raiders, listening for distant footsteps, and preparing the longhouse for another freezing night. The day ended not with relaxation but with a dull, aching collapse onto bedding that smelled of smoke and sweat. This wasn't a life of adventure. It was a life spent fighting exhaustion so constant that you didn't even notice it anymore. People didn't complain, not because they were stronger, but because complaining didn't change the reality outside. In medieval Scandinavia, work didn't keep you alive. It merely delayed dying. When you step outside the longhouse in medieval Scandinavia, you quickly realize that humans were not the only predators. Wolves, bears, and lynxes prowled the forests, and unlike raiders or famine, they didn't give warning. They didn't negotiate. They simply saw weakness and exploited it. Wolves traveled in packs, and their hunting strategies were terrifyingly effective. They followed scents, waited for patterns, and even attacked livestock in coordinated waves. A single family without a strong guard dog or fortified pen could lose goats, sheep, and sometimes humans to these cunning predators. Hunters knew to leave small traps, sharpened stakes, or noise-making devices, but nothing guaranteed safety. Wolves were relentless. A pack that learned where a family stored food could return night after night, striking with precision. Bears were less common but far more deadly. Hibernation was not a guarantee. A starving bear could wander near a village and attack. Villagers learned to recognize the signs: scratches on trees, fresh paw prints in the snow, overturned rocks. When a bear approached, men armed themselves with spears, torches, and courage, often at the cost of life or limb. Bears didn't negotiate. Bears didn't retreat. They took what they wanted, and left nothing for you. Even smaller predators were lethal. Lynxes and wolverines hunted quietly, picking off unattended chickens, puppies, or young children left alone in the forest while gathering firewood. Rabid foxes carried disease. Disease spread from wild animals to livestock, and from livestock to humans. Every encounter in the forest had layers of danger. Villagers developed survival skills out of necessity. They knew where wolves nested, how to read snow for tracks, how to create decoys, and how to move silently. Hunters often left fire or smoke in paths to confuse predators. Wolves were clever, but humans adapted, sometimes too late. A misstep on thin ice, a rustling branch in the wrong place, and the results could be fatal. And yet, despite constant danger, villagers had no choice but to enter the forest every day. Food, firewood, medicinal herbs, and raw materials for tools and clothing were all outside the longhouse. Staying inside meant freezing, starving, or succumbing to disease. Risk was unavoidable. The forests were simultaneously a source of life and a death trap. Children were taught fear as early as they could walk. Stories weren't just stories, they were warnings. Tales of wolves dragging children into darkness, of bears tearing down doors, and of lynxes waiting silently in snowdrifts were repeated nightly. Superstition blended with survival instinct. Parents didn't lie, they educated through terror because ignorance was fatal. Even then, nature had rules far harsher than human fairness. A wolf pack could take one person's life and leave the family intact, or destroy an entire herd, leaving the family to starve. A bear might retreat if challenged, or it might attack. Every interaction was unpredictable. No amount of skill guaranteed survival, only increased the odds by a fraction. And all this was before you considered the humans who wanted what you had. Because in medieval Scandinavia, the forest and the frost were only half the danger. In medieval Scandinavia, disease was not a visitor, it was a constant resident. It hid in the longhouses, it crept through the villages, and it claimed victims silently, often before anyone realized what had happened. Fever, dysentery, and respiratory infections were more feared than raiders or wolves because they struck without warning, spreading faster than any arrow could fly. The longhouses, while protecting families from the cold, created perfect conditions for disease. Smoke from fires coated everything but did little to purify the air. Humidity and lack of ventilation allowed bacteria and mold to thrive. Children slept side by side with elders and infants, sharing warmth and germs. A cough in the corner could mean death for the youngest or weakest family members. Parents learned to watch for subtle signs: sunken eyes, pale skin, cold extremities. Ignoring these signs could be fatal. Hygiene was minimal. Baths were rare, usually reserved for summer months when water could be heated. Hair and beards were infrequently cleaned. Clothes, fur, and blankets were reused, patched, and worn until they fell apart. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constants. Rats and mice ran freely in the longhouse, gnawing on stored grain and carrying disease along with them. Infections from scratches, bites, or burns could fester and kill. There were no doctors, no antibiotics, no modern understanding of sanitation. Every cut, every fever, every cough could be the one that ended your life. Seasonal epidemics were particularly brutal. Dysentery could sweep through a village in days. Those who survived were weak for months. Fevers, often mistaken for colds, sometimes became fatal pneumonia. Influenza, measles, or smallpox might arrive from a passing trader or traveling clan. Villagers relied on herbal remedies, willow bark, juniper berries, and other plants, but even effective treatments were limited and hard to administer. Prevention depended mostly on isolation, but in crowded longhouses, isolation was impossible. Pregnancy and childbirth were perilous. Infant mortality was extreme. Midwives performed births with minimal knowledge and no anesthetics. Complications that are easily treated today often killed mother, child, or both. Families sometimes mourned silently, sometimes quietly buried their dead in frozen soil. A funeral did not end grief, it was merely preparation for the next loss. Disease didn't discriminate, but it did follow patterns. Winter was particularly harsh because nutrition was low, indoor air was stale, and immune systems weakened by cold were more vulnerable. Summer brought its own dangers: contaminated water from melted snow or rivers, insects carrying fevers, and wounds that became infected in humid air. There was no safe season. Every villager knew someone who had disappeared silently. Sometimes it was an old grandmother who stayed behind while the family gathered wood. Sometimes it was a child who fell asleep in the snow. Sometimes it was a young adult who simply weakened and wasted away in their bed. These deaths were ordinary, yet terrifying in their inevitability. And still, the people endured. They worked, hunted, and defended their homes despite the invisible enemy inside their walls. Survival was never guaranteed, it was a daily gamble. You might escape the wolves, the raiders, the frost, and hunger, but a simple cough could undo everything. In medieval Scandinavia, the invisible enemy was often deadlier than the obvious ones, and it reminded every survivor that life was fragile, fleeting, and never to be taken for granted. While wolves and disease haunted the forests and longhouses, another threat lurked closer to home: neighboring clans. In medieval Scandinavia, territory was everything. Fish-rich rivers, fertile valleys, and even modest herds could ignite wars. Villages did not simply trade with neighbors, they defended themselves fiercely, often launching raids to take resources from others before winter starvation claimed them. These clans were not organized armies, they were groups of hardened survivors, skilled in raiding and ambushing. Their knowledge of terrain rivaled any modern military strategist. They knew hidden paths, secret fords across rivers, and weak points in palisades. They tracked movements, remembered every slight, and sometimes attacked in retaliation for insults that happened years before. Loyalty to one's own clan was absolute, and betrayal was punished ruthlessly. A typical raid began before dawn. Raiders moved silently through snow-laden forests, carrying axes, swords, spears, and sometimes bows. Their goal wasn't glory, it was survival. They wanted livestock, grain, tools, and sometimes slaves. Anyone who resisted was killed. Houses could be set ablaze to flush out defenders or simply to destroy what could not be carried. For villagers, there was little time to respond. A mistake of seconds could mean losing a family member, your animals, or your home. Villagers adapted strategies to survive. Some built hidden ditches or reinforced doors with heavy beams. Others created false hiding spots or sent children to secret caves when danger approached. Alarm signals, like the beating of drums or the cry of horns, were learned from a young age. Every sense was trained to detect danger before it was too late. Even routine tasks, fetching water, collecting firewood, required vigilance. A sound out of place, a shadow among the trees, could indicate death. The psychological toll was immense. Fear of raids was constant. Families slept in shifts, some members keeping watch throughout the night. Trust was complicated, a stranger might be a traitor, or they might be a scout for a raiding party. Paranoia was survival instinct. It was impossible to let your guard down. Sometimes conflicts escalated into pitched battles. Villagers who fought to defend their homes learned quickly that courage alone wasn't enough. Strategy, speed, and brutal efficiency decided life or death. Casualties were often high. Survivors carried trauma silently, knowing that the next raid could arrive at any moment. What made raids especially dangerous was timing. Winter made travel slow and dangerous, yet it often drove clans to desperate measures. When food was low, attackers struck because they had no choice. Summer allowed easier movement, but then disease and heat threatened. There was no safe season for peace. Even during times of relative calm, tension simmered beneath the surface, influencing every choice: when to fish, where to herd animals, how far to travel. For a modern person, surviving this environment would be impossible. You would be too slow, too trusting, too unaccustomed to constant danger. Every instinct of comfort, warmth, food, rest, and routine would betray you. Every decision could cost your life. And if you managed to survive the cold, hunger, predators, and disease, a single raiding party could erase your existence in an instant. Medieval Scandinavia was a place where humanity itself was tested daily, where only the resourceful, the vigilant, and the fearless endured. Every day you survived was a small victory, but the next day brought a new challenge, often deadlier than the last. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, communities developed their own laws, strict, uncompromising, and often brutal. Justice in medieval Scandinavia was survival-driven, not fair or equitable by modern standards. A mistake could cost your life, a betrayal could cost your family. There was no courtroom, no judge in robes, the community itself decided. Disputes over land, livestock, or marriage were common. Arguments that might today be settled with negotiation or bureaucracy often ended with violence. If someone stole a goat, the village might respond by taking what they could in retaliation. Feuds could last generations, and families learned early to protect their property and honor. Being cunning was as important as being strong, and betrayal was punished with blood. Even smaller crimes were dealt with swiftly. Lying, cheating, or breaking social norms might bring public shaming, fines, or exile. Exile in this environment was practically a death sentence. To leave the protection of the longhouse and the village meant facing cold, hunger, predators, and raiders alone. Survival was nearly impossible for the unprepared. But the harshest judgments were reserved for moral transgressions. Adultery, dishonesty, or disobedience were seen as threats to social cohesion. A family that could not maintain honor risked being ostracized. In some cases, offenders were beaten or killed to serve as an example. Your life was rarely your own, it belonged to the clan, the family, and the fragile system of rules that kept chaos at bay. Punishments were public. The village needed to see justice enacted to maintain order. Children were trained to understand the consequences of actions. Fear was a teaching tool, just as essential as any other survival skill. You learned early that survival depended on not just your strength, but your ability to obey, conform, and contribute to the collective well-being. Even acts of kindness or compassion had limits. Helping someone outside your village might be noble, but it could attract unwanted attention or anger your own people. Sharing food with a stranger could provoke a raid. Decisions were measured by survival logic, not morality. Every choice carried risk, and the wrong choice could be fatal. Death itself was part of the justice system. Executions were sometimes necessary to maintain order, but they also served as warnings to others. A single violent act could ripple through the village, reminding everyone of the precarious balance between life and death. Funerals were not merely ceremonial, they reinforced the reality that life in this world was fragile, fleeting, and constantly at risk. This constant exposure to life and death consequences shaped every Scandinavian from childhood. Bravery, cunning, and resilience were not admired traits, they were required for survival. Every action, every word, every misstep could mean the difference between living through another harsh winter or disappearing into the snow, unremembered. For a modern person, understanding this justice system is difficult. There is no separation between morality, law, and survival, only the relentless logic of staying alive. If you fail, nature, humans, or the environment will finish the job. There is no leniency, no second chance, no mercy. And yet, despite its brutality, the system worked. It allowed communities to endure harsh climates, endless winters, hunger, and the constant threat of raiders. It was imperfect, painful, and cruel, but it kept enough people alive long enough to survive the next day. Winter in medieval Scandinavia was not just cold, it was a nearly unending adversary that shaped every aspect of life. The snow itself could be deadly, and storms arrived with little warning. Villagers understood that staying inside their longhouses did not guarantee safety. Exposure to cold, blizzards, and frozen terrain could take lives as surely as raiders or disease. Snow could fall for days, covering paths and obscuring rivers, making travel almost impossible. Anyone venturing out risked becoming lost in the white wilderness. Forests transformed into labyrinths of ice-laden trees, and even familiar landmarks became indistinct. Children, livestock, and elderly villagers were especially vulnerable. If someone fell behind during travel, the cold could claim them in minutes. Frostbite and hypothermia were silent killers, creeping in before anyone noticed the danger. Wind made the cold far worse. Gusts sliced through wool, fur, and leather with the precision of a knife. Even brief exposure could numb fingers and toes, making handling tools or weapons impossible. Ice formed on eyelashes, hair, and clothing, adding weight and slowing movement. Snowdrifts could trap the unwary, covering the weak or sickly completely. Some villages maintained a system of lookouts, but even this couldn't stop sudden storms or drifting ice that blocked routes to water and food supplies. Food scarcity worsened during winter. Rivers froze, preventing fishing, hunting was slow and risky, forests offered little sustenance. Preserved foods, salted fish, dried meat, or stored grains, were rationed carefully. Any mistake in storage could lead to spoilage, compounding hunger. Families calculated rations meticulously, sometimes eating less than the minimum to ensure survival for the group. Starvation and cold often arrived together, creating a compounding threat that could kill quietly and efficiently. The longhouse fire was the most important lifeline, yet it required constant attention. Running out of fuel could quickly mean death. Cutting wood in the forest meant exposing yourself to predators and frost. A single misstep, a broken limb, or delayed return could lead to freezing before the household even noticed your absence. Life became a relentless sequence of choices, each carrying potentially fatal consequences. Winter also increased isolation. Communication with neighboring villages became nearly impossible, so help in emergencies was rare. Illnesses spread more easily indoors, as cold weakened immune systems. Pregnant women, infants, and the elderly were particularly at risk. Survival was not just physical, it was mental, requiring constant vigilance and endurance. Despite the hardships, villagers adapted. They learned to predict storms by observing the wind, clouds, and animal behavior. They developed clothing layered with furs, leather, and wool. They constructed shelters and dug snow pits for livestock. Every innovation was driven by necessity, not comfort. Even so, the cold claimed many lives each year, sometimes entire families, leaving only a memory in the snow. For anyone unaccustomed to such conditions, a single winter could be fatal. You would lack the knowledge, the skill, and the resilience to survive. The cold, wind, snow, and ice were not just elements, they were relentless judges of your preparedness. In medieval Scandinavia, winter was always watching, always testing, and often, always winning. Survival in medieval Scandinavia relied as much on tools and weapons as on courage, strength, or endurance. Without the right equipment, even the strongest person could not withstand cold, hunger, or attack. Every axe, knife, spear, or shield was a lifeline, and using them properly often meant the difference between life and death. Axes were the most versatile tool. They chopped firewood, butchered animals, and served as weapons. A dull or poorly maintained axe could fail at the worst moment. Sharpening blades was a constant task, done with whetstones, often outdoors in the freezing wind. People developed skill not just in swinging the axe, but in caring for it, protecting the edge, and predicting how it would behave on wood, bone, or enemy armor. Knives were equally essential. Everyone carried a knife, from children to elders. Knives were used to prepare food, carve tools, skin animals, and defend against predators or raiders. Losing a knife could be catastrophic, and a blunt knife could be almost as deadly to its user as to the intended target. Villagers learned the precise angle to cut meat or fur efficiently, conserving both energy and resources. Spears and bows were primarily for hunting but doubled as defense against raiders or predators. Spears needed to be straight and balanced, with sharpened tips maintained regularly. Bows required practice and careful handling of the wood and sinew used to construct them. Arrows were valuable, losing them in snow or brush could mean a missed opportunity to feed your family or defend your home. Shields were a crucial part of defense against raiders. They were heavy, often made of layered wood with leather covering, and required strength and skill to wield effectively. Shields could block a sword, axe, or spear strike, but poor technique could result in injury or death. Carrying a shield for long hours in freezing conditions demanded stamina, yet in a surprise attack, it might be the only thing standing between you and a raider's blade. Tools also included everyday items that modern people might overlook. Awls, needles, and ropes were necessary to repair clothing, build traps, and fix household structures. Mallets, chisels, and hammers allowed for construction and repair of longhouses and fences. Even small tools required knowledge and precision. A snapped rope or a cracked plank could lead to disaster during a storm, raid, or hunting trip. Every villager became intimately familiar with their equipment from childhood. Training began early. Children learned to handle knives, help with sharpening, carry small axes, and respect the weight of weapons. Elders taught proper technique, emphasizing efficiency and care. Tools were as important as clothing. Without them, survival odds plummeted. Yet even with the best tools, survival was not guaranteed. Equipment failed. Ice broke. Axes dulled. Knives slipped. Spears splintered. Every day presented new challenges, forcing villagers to adapt, repair, and improvise. You could be strong, clever, and fast, but one moment of carelessness, one poorly maintained tool, could undo all your efforts. In medieval Scandinavia, tools were more than objects. They were the difference between life and death. They shaped daily routines, taught responsibility, and dictated skill. For those who survived, mastery of tools became instinct. For those who did not, ignorance of them meant disappearance into snow, forest, or famine. In medieval Scandinavia, beliefs were as essential for survival as tools and weapons. Life was harsh, unpredictable, and filled with threats, both natural and human. Villagers turned to gods, spirits, and superstitions to explain the dangers that surrounded them. Religion offered structure, comfort, and a sense of control in a world where death was constant and often random. The Norse pantheon was deeply embedded in everyday life. Odin, Thor, Freya, and countless lesser gods and spirits were invoked for protection, success in hunting, bountiful harvests, and safety from raids. People believed that offending a deity could invite misfortune, a broken tool, a failed hunt, or the sudden illness of a child. Rituals, sacrifices, and offerings were carefully performed to maintain divine favor. Shrines, often simple wooden structures or carved stones, were common even in small villages. Families might offer a portion of their food, a piece of cloth, or crafted items to spirits believed to inhabit rivers, trees, or stones. Some feared trolls and elves, attributing unexplained misfortunes, lost tools, sudden illness, or strange animal behavior, to their interference. Ignoring these beliefs was dangerous. Misfortune was interpreted as a direct sign of divine displeasure. Fate, or WIRD, played a critical role in the Scandinavian worldview. Villagers accepted that certain events were beyond human control: the death of a loved one, a wolf attack, or the arrival of raiders. This acceptance did not breed resignation but prepared people mentally to endure suffering and act decisively when survival depended on action rather than hope. Superstition guided daily routines. Specific days were considered unlucky for hunting, fishing, or travel. Certain rituals preceded childbirth or journeys into the forest. Tools might be blessed with runes, and charms were hung to ward off evil. These practices were not mere superstition, they were integral to decision-making, influencing timing, movement, and strategy. A misstep could be fatal, so villagers combined practical experience with spiritual guidance. Even warriors believed in divine protection before battle or a raid. Shields, axes, and helmets were often consecrated with runes or oil. Victory was not guaranteed by strength alone, favor from the gods could tip the balance. Losing such favor was catastrophic, interpreted as punishment for moral failure or neglect of tradition. Christianity began to spread in later centuries, introducing new beliefs alongside old ones. Many communities blended pagan practices with Christian rituals, creating a complex web of faith. Churches and monasteries became centers of both worship and social support, though access to them was limited in remote areas. Still, belief remained a vital survival tool, guiding behavior, reinforcing community bonds, and helping people endure the constant threat of death. Religion and superstition were more than spiritual comforts. They shaped every action, every decision, and every moment of life. Without belief, a villager might act recklessly, forget essential precautions, or lose morale in the harshest conditions. Faith, in any form, provided psychological resilience, a weapon as potent as any axe or spear in defending against the cruelty of medieval Scandinavia. In medieval Scandinavia, bringing a child into the world was as dangerous as fighting a wolf or facing a raid. Life expectancy was short, and infant mortality was tragically high. Every birth carried risks not just for the mother, but for the entire household, as survival depended on the family's ability to protect and nurture both. Pregnant women were carefully watched. Labor could last hours or days, and complications often proved fatal. Midwives were experienced villagers who had delivered many children, but they had no medical instruments or anesthetics. They relied on knowledge passed down orally, on herbs, and on intuition. Pain was a constant, natural part of birth. Mothers often gave birth on the floor, wrapped in furs, surrounded by family members who could assist but had no means to save a life if something went wrong. Newborns were particularly vulnerable. Exposure to cold could kill instantly, as even the smallest chill penetrated fragile bodies. Families often used a method called skin-to-skin contact, wrapping infants against a mother's body, to preserve warmth. Furs, blankets, and careful positioning were the difference between life and death. Food scarcity also threatened nursing mothers, as malnourishment weakened milk supply and the mother's health simultaneously. Children were raised with survival in mind. From the moment they could walk, they were taught to gather firewood, feed animals, carry water, and help in every household task. Play was intertwined with lessons of endurance and vigilance. Children learned the dangers of forests, the signs of predators, and the behaviors of neighboring clans. Every misstep in a lesson could carry consequences, as even small accidents might result in injury, frostbite, or worse. Weaning was another critical period. Foods were minimal and often unsafe. Thin porridge, diluted milk, or mashed grains were fed carefully to avoid choking or disease. Infants were sometimes given herbal mixtures believed to strengthen them, though the effectiveness was inconsistent. Parents had to balance nutrition, protection, and limited resources. A miscalculation could mean death. Siblings and older children were also crucial to survival. They helped protect infants from harm, carried supplies, and assisted during crises. Villagers believed that the survival of the young depended on community vigilance, not just parental care. Every family member had a role in ensuring the next generation could endure the harsh winters, the raids, and the constant hunger. Despite careful measures, many children did not survive. Families experienced repeated losses, yet life continued. Grief was tempered by the knowledge that survival was a relentless struggle, and that preparation, vigilance, and skill were the only tools available against a cruel environment. To live even a single day as a child in medieval Scandinavia was to walk a narrow line between life and death. Every breath, every movement, every choice mattered. You learned early that comfort, safety, and stability were privileges, not rights, and that the world outside the longhouse would not pause for you. In medieval Scandinavia, food was never guaranteed. Every meal was a calculated effort, every bite a victory against the relentless winter and unpredictable environment. Villagers depended on a delicate balance of hunting, fishing, gathering, and preserving food, and failure in any of these could result in starvation. Crops were limited by harsh soil and short growing seasons. Barley, rye, and oats were staples, but yields were never abundant. A single early frost could destroy weeks of labor, leaving villagers with little more than stored grain. Preservation was key. Grains were dried, smoked, or stored in pits dug into the earth. However, spoilage, rodents, and damp often ruined supplies, forcing families to ration even the smallest portions. Fishing was both vital and dangerous. Rivers, lakes, and fjords were frozen for much of winter, leaving narrow windows for catching fish. Villagers used nets, hooks, and traps, braving icy water and slippery rocks. One slip could result in drowning or frostbite. Caught fish were salted, smoked, or dried to last the winter, but supplies were never ample, and families often survived on tiny portions. Hunting required skill, patience, and constant awareness of predators. Deer, elk, and smaller game were essential protein sources, but they could be scarce. Traps had to be maintained and reset daily, often in freezing conditions. Wolves and bears frequently stole kills, forcing villagers to guard their food and livestock. Hunting was a battle against both the environment and other predators, including humans. Even with successful hunting and fishing, food scarcity dominated daily life. Rations were strict. Adults often ate less to allow children a chance at survival. Elders were expected to consume the least. Hunger was constant, gnawing at the stomach, sapping energy, and dulling the mind. People learned to survive on thin broth, dried fish, and small amounts of grain. Every morsel was precious. Seasonal variation added complexity. Summer brought more abundant foraging opportunities. Berries, nuts, mushrooms, and herbs could supplement diets. Spring required careful planning, as stored food dwindled and new crops were not yet ready. Families calculated daily survival, balancing energy expended against calories gained. Miscalculations could mean exhaustion, frostbite, or death. Food scarcity also influenced social behavior. Villagers were deeply protective of their stores, wary of outsiders, and prepared to defend resources violently. Sharing was rare, and barter was carefully controlled. Raiders targeted villages precisely because of the food they stored, creating a vicious cycle of scarcity, theft, and conflict. Despite these hardships, villagers adapted. They developed techniques to stretch limited resources, including creative preservation methods, careful rationing, and communal hunting. Children learned early the importance of saving, preparing, and respecting food. The slightest negligence could cost a life. In medieval Scandinavia, hunger was as much a constant companion as cold, disease, and human threats. Surviving even a single day required vigilance, skill, and endurance. Those who failed to respect the scarcity of food often paid the ultimate price. In medieval Scandinavia, clothing was not fashion, it was survival. Without proper layers, you would freeze in minutes, even indoors. The frigid winters and icy winds made wool, fur, and leather essential for everyone, from infants to the elderly. Villagers layered garments to trap warmth. Linen undergarments absorbed moisture from sweat and kept skin relatively dry. Over this, they wore woolen tunics, leggings, and cloaks. Fur, usually from domesticated animals like sheep or hunted creatures such as foxes and reindeer, lined hoods, gloves, and boots. Even mittens were carefully crafted to protect fingers while allowing basic dexterity for handling tools or weapons. Clothing was heavy, cumbersome, and often uncomfortable, but every stitch mattered. Holes or worn patches were repaired immediately, because exposure to wind or snow could be deadly. Water resistance was vital. Wet clothing meant hypothermia within hours. Villagers improvised with grease or pitch to repel moisture, but supplies were limited. Every item was precious, often passed down through generations or repurposed. Footwear was equally critical. Boots were made of thick leather, sometimes lined with fur, to protect feet from ice and snow. If a boot became wet, it was removed, dried near the fire, and repaired if possible. Frostbite could occur quickly, particularly in children or elderly family members, and a lost toe or foot could severely reduce survival odds during winter. Children's clothing was minimal, often worn hand-me-downs, yet parents prioritized warmth. Even infants were swaddled in layers of wool and fur, tucked close to their mothers for heat. Families understood that the young were most vulnerable to cold, and extra care was given to clothing and shelter. Armor was rare for common villagers but crucial for those expecting conflict with raiders. Leather and chainmail were reserved for warriors or those protecting the village. Shields, helmets, and reinforced clothing acted as both defense and additional insulation. Fighting in extreme cold required skill. Exposed skin could frostbite faster than a blade could strike. The effort to maintain clothing consumed hours of every day. Sewing, mending, and reinforcing garments was as essential as collecting firewood or preparing food. Losing or damaging a garment in winter could be a life-threatening error. Families shared materials, traded furs, and improvised with whatever could provide warmth. Despite layers, frostbite, hypothermia, and cold-related illness were constant threats. Villagers learned to monitor each other. Pale skin, shivering, and slowed movement were warning signs. Ignoring symptoms could quickly lead to death. Clothing was your first line of defense against the environment, and its failure often meant your last. In medieval Scandinavia, survival depended as much on skillfully crafted garments as on swords, spears, or axes. The cold was relentless, unforgiving, and lethal. Without proper clothing, you would not last a single day. In medieval Scandinavia, access to clean water was never guaranteed, and drinking the wrong water could be as deadly as facing a raiding party or predator. Villagers depended on rivers, streams, and melted snow, but each source carried hidden risks. Contaminated water could bring dysentery, cholera, or other fatal illnesses, especially in a longhouse filled with people and animals. Winter made water collection even more dangerous. Rivers often froze over, forcing villagers to break ice to reach liquid water. A single slip could result in hypothermia, drowning, or a broken limb. Children were rarely allowed to fetch water alone, yet even adults faced extreme danger. Carrying heavy containers across ice or snow required strength and vigilance. One misstep could be fatal. Villagers sometimes dug small pits to collect water, relying on melted snow or rain. These reservoirs were convenient but easily contaminated. Animals could drink from them, or debris and dirt could fall in. Families had to filter water carefully, often using cloth or slow-settling methods. Boiling water was possible but required fuel, a precious resource. Every decision regarding water involved calculating survival odds. Contaminated water was a silent killer. Dysentery and other intestinal diseases spread quickly, often incapacitating adults and children alike. A single infected person could contaminate storage, leading to widespread illness. Symptoms, diarrhea, fever, dehydration, could appear within hours. Villagers had few remedies beyond rest, herbs, and careful monitoring. Death could follow swiftly if the illness struck the young, elderly, or already weakened by hunger and cold. Even when water appeared safe, nature imposed its own limits. Streams could dry unexpectedly, ice could block wells, and snow might be too compacted or dirty for consumption. Villagers constantly monitored local sources, learning the patterns of rivers and springs over years. Survival required knowledge, preparation, and constant vigilance. Water scarcity also shaped social behavior. Villages often guarded wells or freshwater sources, restricting access to outsiders. Conflict sometimes arose over access, with raiders targeting villages that controlled vital resources. Children learned early that water was not to be wasted, and adults were careful not to expose supplies unnecessarily. Even a short lapse in judgment could be fatal. Drinking untreated water, ignoring ice thickness, or failing to protect storage could kill as efficiently as hunger or wolves. Villagers respected water not just as life, but as a critical survival asset. Every drop was measured, rationed, and treated with the attention it deserved. In medieval Scandinavia, surviving even a single day required constant awareness of water sources, risks, and timing. One misstep could undo all other precautions, leaving families vulnerable to dehydration, illness, or death. Water was a hidden enemy, invisible yet lethal, and it demanded respect equal to the cold, predators, and human threats that surrounded the longhouse. In medieval Scandinavia, fire was both a savior and a potential killer. Without it, the cold would claim lives within hours. With it, the longhouse was warm, food could be cooked, and metal tools could be repaired. Yet fire was fragile and unpredictable, one mistake could destroy everything. Maintaining a fire required constant attention. Families used dried wood, peat, or sometimes animal dung as fuel. The wood had to be chopped, carried, and stacked in advance. Rain, snow, or high humidity could render fuel useless, forcing villagers to gather more during dangerous conditions. Each day involved tending the hearth, feeding it carefully to maintain warmth without wasting resources. The fire also enabled cooking. Boiling water, preparing soups, or roasting fish and meat were essential for survival. Undercooked food could lead to illness, while overcooked meals wasted precious calories. Cooking required skill and attention. A burnt meal might seem trivial, but in a famine, it could cost energy, strength, or morale. Food and fire were inseparable allies in survival. But fire was dangerous. Longhouses were made of timber, thatch, and moss, all highly flammable. A spark from the hearth could ignite the roof or walls. Smoke inhalation could suffocate those inside long before flames reached them. Families had to constantly monitor the fire, ensure proper ventilation, and prevent children from getting too close. A careless moment could mean death for everyone under the same roof. During raids, fire was a weapon and a threat. Attackers could set houses ablaze to flush defenders or destroy stored food. Villagers often barricaded doors and used shields to protect against flames, but escaping a burning longhouse was perilous. Snow could help smother flames, but in heavy storms, it was sometimes impossible to save the building. Fire demanded respect and caution, whether used for warmth, cooking, or defense. Smoke itself posed challenges. It was necessary to keep insects and pests away, but too much smoke could irritate eyes, lungs, and skin. Families learned to balance heat and smoke, maintaining just enough fire to survive without creating a suffocating environment. Chronic smoke exposure contributed to respiratory illnesses, compounding the dangers of winter and disease. Even outside the longhouse, fire was vital. Campfires provided warmth for travelers, hunters, or raiding parties. Without fire, hypothermia became inevitable. Gathering materials for fire in forests was risky, as predators or rival clans could strike. Carrying embers over long distances required ingenuity and careful handling. In medieval Scandinavia, fire was a lifeline, a tool, and a constant hazard. Mastery over it required skill, attention, and vigilance. Neglect could mean freezing to death, burning alive, or succumbing to illness. Every family member contributed to maintaining it, knowing that survival depended on balance: too little fire, and the cold kills; too much, and the flames destroy. In medieval Scandinavia, no one lived in true peace. Even after enduring frost, hunger, disease, and wild animals, villagers faced another relentless threat: raids from neighboring clans or desperate outsiders. These attacks were sudden, brutal, and often fatal. Survival depended on vigilance, preparation, and sometimes, sheer luck. Raids were typically strategic. Attackers studied villages, observing routines, guard rotations, and vulnerable points. They targeted livestock, stored food, tools, and occasionally people to enslave or ransom. Villagers often had no warning until attackers were almost upon them. Every creak in the snow, every shadow among the trees, demanded immediate attention. Hesitation could be deadly. Defense relied on both skill and improvisation. Longhouses were fortified with heavy doors and reinforced walls, sometimes supplemented with ditches or fences. Shields, axes, and spears were kept within reach at all times. Every member of the household, men, women, and older children, had a role in defense. Even small villages organized quickly, forming lines to block entrances or protect the young and elderly. Surprise was the attacker's greatest advantage. They could strike before the sun rose, during storms, or under the cover of forests. Fires were sometimes used to smoke defenders or create confusion. Screams, shouting, and the clash of weapons echoed through snow-laden valleys. Panic could easily spread, leaving families disorganized and vulnerable. A single error could mean death. Casualties were brutal and personal. Attackers often killed quickly, sometimes leaving bodies in view to intimidate survivors. Livestock was slaughtered or stolen, tools destroyed, and supplies carried off. Even when families survived, the psychological trauma lingered. The fear of the next raid shaped behavior for months, even years. Raids weren't always purely violent. Some involved negotiation, tribute, or extortion, but the underlying threat of force remained constant. Villagers adapted through routines, watches, and escape plans. They stored weapons and food in hidden caches and created secret escape routes. Children were taught to flee or hide, to signal danger quietly, and to trust instincts over comfort. The aftermath of a raid was grueling. Families repaired homes, replaced stolen tools, and tended to injuries. Hunger often worsened, as raided stores left little food for the winter. Disease could spread through wounds or contaminated supplies. Surviving the attack was only the first battle; enduring the aftermath was equally brutal. Even during times of relative peace, the shadow of raids loomed. Villagers never relaxed entirely. Every step outside, every trip to gather firewood or water, carried the risk of encountering raiders. Life in medieval Scandinavia was a constant negotiation with danger, and only those who were vigilant, resourceful, and fearless survived even a single day. In medieval Scandinavia, survival depended on skillful hunting and foraging. Each day required vigilance, endurance, and an intimate understanding of the environment. Failure to gather sufficient food or resources could be fatal, especially in winter when nature offered few alternatives. Hunting was dangerous. Villagers relied on spears, bows, and traps to catch deer, elk, rabbits, and birds. The forest was home to wolves, bears, and lynxes, all of which could attack hunters unprepared or unwary. Tracking prey required sharp eyes, patience, and knowledge of animal behavior. One misstep, a snapped twig or misjudged snow, could alert predators to your presence. The hunter's life depended on silence, speed, and precision. Fishing was equally perilous. Rivers and lakes were often frozen, requiring ice cutting and careful placement of nets or hooks. Falling through ice was a constant risk, especially in winter. Freezing water could immobilize even the strongest swimmer, making hypothermia inevitable. Yet fish were essential protein, and families relied on successful catches to survive long winters. Foraging added another layer of complexity. Berries, mushrooms, nuts, and herbs provided vital nutrients but required knowledge. Some plants were poisonous, and even experienced foragers could misidentify them. Collecting resources often meant venturing into the forest, exposing oneself to both wild predators and potential raiders. Every decision carried life-or-death consequences. Seasonal timing was critical. Summer offered a wealth of edible plants and easier hunting conditions, but raids were more frequent. Winter provided fewer options, and travel became treacherous. Villagers had to plan carefully, storing dried meats, salted fish, and preserved grains in anticipation of famine. Miscalculations could result in starvation or exposure to the elements. Children learned these skills early. They helped set traps, collect firewood, and monitor livestock. They were trained to recognize animal tracks, understand seasonal patterns, and identify edible plants. Every misstep taught a lesson, sometimes painfully. Survival required not only knowledge but constant vigilance and adaptability. Even seasoned hunters were not guaranteed success. A lost animal, stolen supplies, or sudden predator attack could undo hours of effort. Villagers learned humility in the face of nature's unpredictability. Every hunt, every foraging trip was a calculated gamble, balancing risk and reward. In medieval Scandinavia, hunting and foraging were not leisurely activities, they were daily battles for survival. The forest was generous only to those who understood its rules, and cruel to those who underestimated it. For a modern person, the skills, patience, and constant awareness required would be overwhelming. Even the smallest mistake could mean death, and no one survived without mastering these deadly routines. In medieval Scandinavia, survival meant more than fighting hunger, disease, and raiders. Wild predators were constant threats. Wolves, bears, lynxes, and even large birds of prey stalked forests, rivers, and valleys. These creatures were not merely nuisances, they were lethal hunters capable of killing humans, livestock, or both. Wolves were particularly feared. They traveled in packs, coordinated, and could follow prey for miles. Lone villagers or small children venturing into forests were prime targets. Livestock was constantly at risk. Farmers built sturdy pens and watchfires, but even reinforced enclosures could fail under persistent attacks. Wolves could tear through weak structures, leaving families without food and exposed to starvation. Bears were sporadic but deadly. They were less likely to attack humans unless provoked or hungry, but when encounters occurred, they were often fatal. Hunters approached forests with extreme caution, using knowledge of bear habits and timing to minimize risk. A misjudged step could mean an immediate, violent death. Lynxes and smaller predators were less dangerous to humans but still threatened livestock and supplies. Their stealth made them difficult to detect. Dogs were trained to alert villagers, but their protection was not infallible. Even minor injuries inflicted by predators could fester into deadly infections due to the lack of medical care. Birds of prey, such as eagles and hawks, sometimes threatened poultry or young children left unattended near open fields. Villagers used scare tactics, nets, and early warning signals to protect vulnerable resources. Every threat, no matter the size, required attention and strategy. Night brought additional dangers. Darkness amplified predator advantage. Snow muffled sound but made tracks easier to follow, creating a paradox for hunters and defenders. Fires and torches offered light and a measure of safety, but they could also attract unwanted attention. Sleep was never entirely safe, and watch shifts were routine, even for children and the elderly. Villagers developed extensive knowledge of animal behavior. Tracking skills, understanding territorial markings, and predicting movement patterns were essential. Livestock were not just penned, they were carefully monitored, rotated between pastures, and sometimes moved to safer locations during harsh seasons. Even with experience, predators could strike unexpectedly. Hunger, territorial expansion, or coincidence brought humans and wild animals into deadly proximity. One moment of inattention, a child straying too far, a hunter distracted, could end a life instantly. Survival required constant awareness and respect for the dangers lurking in the forest. In medieval Scandinavia, humans were not apex predators, they coexisted in a fragile balance with nature. Wolves, bears, and other predators shaped daily routines, village planning, and even social behaviors. Understanding these threats, preparing for them, and responding swiftly were essential skills, without which even a single day could be your last. In medieval Scandinavia, the longhouse was more than a home, it was a fortress, a workspace, and a lifeline. Survival depended on its structure, maintenance, and the community that inhabited it. Every longhouse reflected the harsh realities of the environment, from the bitter cold to raids, predators, and disease. Longhouses were made of timber, stone foundations, and thatched or sod roofs. Walls were thick to retain heat, and the building often housed extended families, sometimes up to 20 people. Central fires provided warmth and a place to cook, but smoke management was critical. Poorly ventilated longhouses could suffocate residents or spread respiratory illness, yet insufficient smoke would allow insects and pests to thrive. Sleeping arrangements were tightly packed. Families slept on raised platforms covered with furs and blankets. Space was minimal, but proximity helped conserve heat. Young children slept with mothers, the elderly shared close quarters with caregivers. Every body generated warmth, but every breath spread disease. Villagers understood the balance between comfort, safety, and health, a miscalculation could kill. Storage was another critical element. Grain, salted fish, dried meat, and firewood were kept inside to protect against the cold and theft. Livestock sometimes sheltered in attached stalls, providing warmth and easy access to food. But animals also brought disease, parasites, and odors. Families had to maintain cleanliness without modern tools, balancing hygiene with practicality. Longhouses were vulnerable to fire and raids. A single spark could engulf the structure, destroying food, tools, and shelter in minutes. Defending a longhouse required coordination, barricaded doors, weapons at hand, and watch shifts throughout the night. Even when unthreatened by raiders, inhabitants remained vigilant. Children learned early to recognize the signs of danger, from unusual noises to shifts in firelight. Maintenance was constant. Roofs had to be repaired after storms, walls needed reinforcement, thatch had to be replaced regularly. Tools for construction were valuable, and knowledge of repairs was essential for survival. A neglected longhouse could become a death trap during winter, storms, or attacks. Despite its challenges, the longhouse was a social hub. Cooking, crafting, storytelling, and planning all took place under its roof. Skills and knowledge were passed down through generations, teaching children hunting, carpentry, and vigilance. Every resident contributed to survival, understanding that the structure itself was a collective shield against the harsh world outside. Even with the best longhouse, survival was never guaranteed. Harsh weather, disease, fire, and raids constantly tested the building and its occupants. Life inside demanded cooperation, skill, and unwavering attention. For a modern person, even a day inside such a longhouse would reveal just how fragile and perilous daily life truly was. In medieval Scandinavia, illness was as deadly as hunger, cold, or raiders. Villagers had no modern medicine, no antibiotics, and limited understanding of disease. A simple fever, infection, or wound could quickly become fatal, and the line between life and death was thin. Common illnesses included dysentery, smallpox, respiratory infections, and complications from injuries. Malnutrition and cold weakened immune systems, making villagers especially vulnerable. Even minor cuts could fester, a small wound left untreated could result in gangrene and death. Every injury was a race against time and circumstance. Healing relied on herbal knowledge, passed down orally through generations. Midwives, elders, and designated healers used plants, roots, and barks to treat fevers, infections, and pain. Willow bark, for example, was used to reduce fever, while herbs like yarrow and juniper were applied to wounds. Remedies were inconsistent, and their effectiveness depended on the healer's skill and the patient's resilience. Illness affected the entire household. When one member fell sick, others had to care for them while continuing essential tasks like chopping wood, fetching water, or hunting. The sick could not contribute to survival, placing additional strain on the family. Sometimes, difficult choices had to be made, rationing food or prioritizing care based on the likelihood of survival. Childbirth added further risk. Complications often led to maternal or infant death, and postpartum infections were common. The absence of sterile instruments or antibiotics meant that even minor infections could be fatal. Pregnant women relied on midwives, herbal remedies, and divine intervention to survive. Preventive measures were limited but crucial. Families maintained cleanliness, kept fire and smoke running to deter pests, and separated the sick as best as possible. Herbs were burned to purify air, and charms or prayers were employed alongside practical measures. Faith and superstition intertwined with survival, offering both hope and structure in the face of uncertainty. Even with care, illness often spread rapidly. Longhouses were crowded, making contagion almost inevitable. Villagers learned to recognize early symptoms, isolate the sick, and prepare remedies immediately. Time lost could mean death. For a modern person, the harsh reality is shocking. Without medicine, hygiene standards, or nutritional knowledge, surviving even minor illnesses required resilience, skill, and a great deal of luck. In medieval Scandinavia, disease was not a rare threat, it was an ever-present companion, lurking silently and claiming lives without mercy. In medieval Scandinavia, social status could determine who lived and who died. Villages were organized into hierarchical structures, and one's place in society affected access to food, protection, and resources. Understanding and navigating this hierarchy was as important as skill with tools or weapons. At the top were chieftains or clan leaders, who controlled land, livestock, and defense. They commanded respect and loyalty, often providing protection in exchange for service or tribute. Being in favor with a leader could mean access to the best food, warmest sleeping places, and guidance during raids or harsh winters. Conversely, falling out of favor could leave individuals vulnerable to starvation, exile, or even execution. Freemen, skilled farmers, hunters, and craftspeople, made up the bulk of the population. They were responsible for maintaining longhouses, producing food, and defending the village. While they had certain rights and autonomy, they still owed allegiance to their leaders. Their survival depended on competence, cooperation, and maintaining relationships within the community. Thralls, or slaves, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. They had little autonomy, limited food, and were often tasked with the most dangerous labor. Their survival depended on obedience, resilience, and the goodwill of those above them. Illness, cold, and exposure hit thralls hardest, as they often received minimal shelter or protection. Marriage, alliances, and family connections also influenced survival. A well-connected family could secure better resources and protection. Children inherited not only material wealth but also social status. Those born into lower ranks faced harsher conditions from the start, learning early that life was a constant struggle against circumstance and hierarchy. Social mobility existed but was limited. Exceptional skill, bravery in battle, or strategic alliances could elevate a family's standing. Yet these opportunities were rare, and failure often meant death. Competition for resources, status, and protection was constant, shaping behavior, social norms, and even morality. The hierarchy also influenced justice. Punishments for crimes were often harsher for lower-status individuals. A freeman might be fined for theft, while a thrall could face execution. Leaders acted both as judges and enforcers, blending law with survival logic. The system reinforced order, but it also ensured that vulnerability was built into the social structure. Even in moments of daily life, eating, sleeping, or performing tasks, social hierarchy dictated who acted first, who received aid, and who bore the brunt of danger. Understanding and respecting these structures was essential. A misstep in etiquette, a challenge to authority, or a breach of loyalty could spell immediate disaster. In medieval Scandinavia, survival was not only physical but social. Skill, strength, and knowledge mattered, but your rank, alliances, and ability to navigate the village hierarchy often decided whether you lived to see the next day. In medieval Scandinavia, life was a cycle of raids, revenge, and retaliation. Villages were constantly aware that an attack could occur at any moment, and surviving one raid often meant preparing for the next. Violence was not random, it followed patterns, traditions, and grudges that could last generations. Raids were motivated by survival, wealth, and honor. Stealing livestock, food, or weapons from a neighbor could mean life or death for a struggling family. Conversely, failure to defend your own village was seen as weakness, damaging reputation and inviting further attacks. Villagers learned early that strength, cunning, and readiness were as essential as warmth or food. Revenge was a powerful motivator. Families and clans who lost members to a raid often organized counterattacks. The desire to avenge deaths or thefts was deeply embedded in social expectations. These retaliatory raids were violent and strategic, often escalating conflicts between neighboring communities. Neutrality was difficult, avoiding involvement could invite suspicion or future attacks. Preparation for raids involved constant vigilance. Watch shifts were maintained day and night. Lookouts scanned forests and fjords for signs of approaching raiders. Weapons were kept sharp and within reach, and defensive structures were reinforced regularly. Even when no attack was imminent, every longhouse was a fortress in miniature. Survival required not just fighting skill but intelligence. Villagers studied raider patterns, anticipated movements, and used the environment to their advantage. Forests, rivers, and terrain features were integrated into defensive strategies. Ambushes could protect livestock, hide children, and ensure that the village's most vulnerable members were safe. Mistakes, however, were often fatal. Children observed and learned from a young age. Boys trained in the use of weapons and learned to defend themselves, girls learned tactics for protecting the household and supporting warriors. Stories of past raids, victories, and losses were passed down orally, reinforcing caution and respect for danger. Every lesson carried the weight of life or death experience. Even after repelling raiders, the aftermath was grueling. Buildings needed repair, food supplies replenished, and wounds treated. Psychological trauma lingered, fear and tension pervaded daily life. Families understood that surviving one attack did not guarantee safety from the next, and that the cycle of violence could continue indefinitely. For a modern observer, the relentlessness of raids is hard to imagine. Villagers were never truly at ease, peace was temporary, survival required constant awareness, and vengeance was a social duty. In medieval Scandinavia, the threat of violence shaped every action, teaching that life was fragile, fleeting, and endlessly precarious. In medieval Scandinavia, winter was the ultimate test of survival. Months of darkness, freezing temperatures, and relentless snow turned everyday life into a constant struggle. Even the strongest, most skilled villagers risked death during the harshest months, and the cold spared no one. Snow and ice made travel perilous. Villagers had to clear paths for themselves, their livestock, and the transport of firewood or food. Rivers froze, making fishing and water collection more difficult. Slips and falls could result in broken bones or hypothermia, and venturing too far from shelter was extremely risky. Even a single misstep could be fatal. Hunger was intensified during winter. Stored food had to last until spring, but spoilage, theft, or poor preservation could reduce supplies. Fresh meat, vegetables, and berries were scarce, and villagers often survived on thin broths, dried fish, or leftover grains. Malnutrition weakened the body, increasing vulnerability to cold, disease, and infection. Starvation was a constant, gnawing threat. Fires were vital but required constant attention. Without proper fuel, the longhouse could quickly become unbearably cold. Firewood had to be chopped, carried, and carefully rationed. Overuse could leave families exposed during a sudden cold snap, while underuse risked hypothermia. Every ember mattered, and fire management demanded skill, foresight, and teamwork. The cold also heightened disease risk. Frostbite, respiratory infections, and exposure-related illnesses were common. Small cuts or abrasions could freeze, become infected, and lead to serious complications. Elderly villagers and children were especially vulnerable. Survival depended on constant monitoring and care, with the entire household contributing to vigilance. Predators became more daring during winter. Wolves and bears, struggling to find food, approached villages more frequently. Hunters and watchmen faced greater risks, and livestock was particularly threatened. Protective measures had to be intensified, from reinforced enclosures to night watches. Even routine chores, like fetching water or firewood, carried life-threatening dangers. Psychologically, winter was grueling. Long nights, isolation, and constant vigilance drained mental and emotional reserves. Villagers coped through community, storytelling, and shared tasks, but fear was always present. A single mistake, a dropped weapon, a misjudged snowbank, a neglected fire, could end a life. Even the most prepared villagers understood one brutal truth: winter could kill as surely as any enemy or predator. Success required skill, endurance, and vigilance every hour of every day. For a modern person, unaccustomed to prolonged exposure to extreme cold and scarcity, even surviving a single day of medieval Scandinavian winter would be an unimaginable challenge. Even in a world dominated by survival, medieval Scandinavians found moments of celebration and ritual. Festivals, seasonal gatherings, and religious ceremonies provided temporary relief from cold, hunger, and constant danger. But even these moments were intertwined with the realities of survival. Seasonal festivals marked transitions in the year. Winter solstice, summer gatherings, and harvest celebrations were opportunities to honor gods, spirits, and ancestors. Families gathered in longhouses, shared food, and performed dances or songs. Firelight flickered against walls, laughter briefly replaced fear, and communal warmth reinforced social bonds. Yet food was still rationed carefully. Excess could threaten survival if stores were low. Rituals were deeply connected to protection and prosperity. Offerings to gods or spirits were meant to ensure bountiful hunts, healthy livestock, and safe passage through dangerous lands. Items offered included food, crafted tools, and occasionally small sacrifices. People believed that ignoring these rituals could bring misfortune, spoiled grain, failed hunts, or death in battle. Superstition and faith were woven into survival itself. Even celebrations could be dangerous. Large gatherings attracted attention from raiders, who might strike when villagers were distracted. Fire inside crowded longhouses increased the risk of accidents. People also had to maintain vigilance over children and livestock. Joy and danger existed side by side, a reminder that no respite was ever complete. Music, storytelling, and games played important roles. Stories of past raids, legendary heroes, and ancestral deeds educated the young and reinforced cultural identity. Storytelling was not merely entertainment, it was a method of transmitting survival knowledge, cautionary tales, and social norms. Music and rhythmic activity boosted morale and strengthened communal bonds, critical psychological tools in a harsh, unforgiving environment. Religious ceremonies, often blending pagan and emerging Christian elements, were occasions for unity and reflection. Prayers, chants, and blessings were believed to protect families from illness, predators, and human threats. Even when faith alone could not prevent death, it offered structure, hope, and courage to endure hardship. Yet the fleeting respite of festivals did not erase the ever-present dangers. Once the celebration ended, villagers returned to daily survival, hunting, gathering, maintaining fires, and guarding against predators or raiders. The lessons of hardship were never forgotten, and even moments of joy reinforced the constant need for vigilance and preparation. In medieval Scandinavia, survival demanded constant attention, but festivals and rituals offered brief but vital psychological sustenance. These gatherings reminded villagers that life, though perilous, also contained moments of connection, tradition, and community, essential for enduring a world where death was always near. In medieval Scandinavia, leaving the safety of your village was a gamble with life itself. Travel, whether for trade, diplomacy, or seasonal hunting, exposed villagers to the cold, predators, disease, and hostile humans. Yet isolation was not sustainable, survival often depended on connections beyond the longhouse. Villagers traveled by foot, sled, or boat, depending on season and terrain. Snow and ice made land routes treacherous. Slopes, frozen rivers, and deep snow could cause injuries or slow progress, leading to frostbite or exhaustion. Boats and rafts were essential for navigating fjords and rivers, but storms, ice, or strong currents could easily capsize them. Every journey required careful planning, preparation, and skill. Trade was essential for acquiring resources not available locally. Metal tools, salt, rare herbs, and clothing materials often came from distant villages or regions. Traders were respected and feared, they could bring wealth or disaster. Attacks by raiders on trading parties were common. Merchants traveled with weapons, guards, or in convoys to survive. Even a short trip could mean the difference between acquiring life-saving goods or never returning home. Travelers had to understand terrain, weather patterns, and seasonal dangers. Winter trips were the deadliest, requiring knowledge of frozen rivers, hidden crevasses, and safe paths through snow-laden forests. Summer offered easier travel but increased exposure to raiders and wild animals. Timing, speed, and resource management were critical for survival. Interactions with outsiders were risky. Villagers could meet friendly traders, hostile raiders, or rival clans. Every encounter required judgment and diplomacy. Misjudging intentions could lead to violence, theft, or death. Alliances and trust were fragile, and travelers relied on both observation and intuition to navigate human threats. Even within the village, travel carried consequences. Leaving behind vulnerable longhouses, livestock, or children meant others had to compensate. Families had to decide who could safely leave and who must stay, balancing the need for resources with the risk of exposure. Miscalculation could imperil everyone. Disease was another hidden danger during travel. Exposure to new environments, crowded inns, or poorly preserved food increased the risk of illness. Without proper care or resources, a traveler could become incapacitated or die far from home. In medieval Scandinavia, survival beyond the village demanded courage, preparation, and skill. Every journey was a calculated risk, the rewards could ensure the village's survival, while a single misstep could mean death. For a modern person accustomed to comfort and security, the dangers of travel would be overwhelming. Even a single day outside the longhouse tested the limits of human endurance. In medieval Scandinavia, tools were not optional, they were essential for life and death. Every villager needed to know how to create, maintain, and use tools effectively. Axes, knives, needles, looms, and fishing equipment were the foundation of survival, and losing or breaking a critical tool could be fatal. Axes were multi-purpose. They chopped firewood, built longhouses, crafted weapons, and sometimes defended against predators or raiders. Blades had to be sharpened constantly, handles repaired, and every part maintained. A dull axe could mean failed hunting or insufficient firewood, mistakes that directly endangered life. Knives were essential for everything from preparing food to crafting clothing and tools. Even small blades required care. Rust, dullness, or breakage could halt critical tasks. Families often passed down knives for generations, knowing that their loss could cripple survival efforts. Sewing tools and looms were vital. Clothing was heavy, expensive, and needed constant repair. Furs had to be stitched, holes patched, and garments adapted for changing seasons. Neglecting sewing could leave a villager exposed to frostbite or injury. Every stitch represented hours of work and countless lives indirectly saved. Fishing gear, traps, and snares required ingenuity and knowledge of local conditions. Nets had to be woven, traps set in optimal locations, and bait replenished regularly. Hunters learned animal behavior, seasonal migration, and feeding patterns. Mistakes meant empty traps, lost food, and increased risk of starvation. Craftsmanship extended to defense. Shields, spears, and simple armor had to be maintained or crafted from scratch. A poorly made weapon could fail in a raid or hunting trip, with fatal consequences. Knowledge of wood, leather, and metal properties was essential. Families often shared expertise, ensuring that skill passed from generation to generation. Children learned practical skills early. Boys and girls alike were expected to contribute, weaving, sharpening, mending, and learning craft techniques critical for survival. Every skill taught resilience, resourcefulness, and independence. Without these abilities, a single day could turn deadly. Even seemingly small tasks, maintaining a fire poker, repairing a door latch, or mending a shoe, had life or death consequences. Villagers learned that neglect, laziness, or inexperience could lead to exposure, injury, or loss of resources. Survival depended not on strength alone but on competence, attentiveness, and mastery of tools. In medieval Scandinavia, skill was life. Villagers who could craft, repair, and improvise survived, those who could not, perished. Every tool, every technique, and every lesson learned from elders contributed directly to enduring the harsh, unforgiving environment. A single day without these skills was a day of risk, often insurmountable. In medieval Scandinavia, childhood was a period of training for survival, not play. From their earliest days, children were immersed in the harsh realities of their world. Every task, story, and lesson was designed to prepare them for life in a land of cold, hunger, predators, and human threats. Infants were swaddled in layers of wool and fur, kept close to their mothers for warmth and protection. Even basic survival was a communal effort, as parents ensured that the youngest had the best chance against frostbite and disease. Early exposure to cold, limited food, and shared labor instilled resilience, though at great risk. As they grew, children learned practical skills through observation and hands-on experience. Boys and girls helped tend livestock, gather firewood, fetch water, and repair clothing. They assisted in hunting preparations, set traps, and learned to identify edible plants and herbs. Every lesson taught the delicate balance between risk and reward in survival tasks. Storytelling played a crucial educational role. Elders recounted past raids, hunts, and lessons about predators. These stories conveyed not only cultural values but also critical knowledge about dangers, strategies, and environmental patterns. Folktales often blended practical advice with warnings, ensuring children learned survival principles in an engaging and memorable way. Weapon training began early. Boys learned to handle spears, knives, and bows, practicing under careful supervision. Girls were taught defensive skills, including preparing longhouses, guarding children, and managing resources during crises. Every child learned that self-defense was not optional, it was a daily necessity. Social behavior and hierarchy were also instilled from a young age. Children learned respect for elders, obedience to leaders, and the responsibilities tied to their social position. Thralls were trained in hard labor and obedience, while freemen and higher-ranking children learned strategy, negotiation, and community leadership. Survival depended on both skill and social awareness. Health education was informal but essential. Children were taught how to tend minor wounds, identify signs of frostbite, and understand which herbs could treat illness. Mistakes were dangerous, and lessons were learned through observation, guidance, and sometimes painful personal experience. By adolescence, a child's life skills were nearly equivalent to an adult's. Survival required knowledge, endurance, vigilance, and intuition. Every misstep, a forgotten tool, misread animal tracks, or careless exposure to cold, could result in serious injury or death. The lessons of childhood were not merely academic, they were the foundation for surviving each perilous day. In medieval Scandinavia, there was no childhood in the modern sense. Learning to survive was immediate and all-encompassing. Children who failed to master essential skills, adapt to the harsh climate, or respect social and environmental dangers often did not survive to adulthood. Even a single day without these lessons could be fatal. In medieval Scandinavia, religion and belief were intertwined with survival. Villagers relied on gods, spirits, and ancestral powers not just for comfort but as practical guidance in a world where death could come from frost, famine, predators, or raiders. Pagan traditions were dominant, though Christian influences gradually spread. Gods and spirits represented forces of nature, protection, and prosperity. Thor, Odin, and Freya were invoked for strength, fertility, and safe passage through perilous landscapes. Villagers believed that neglecting rituals or offending deities could bring misfortune, such as failed hunts, disease, or raids. Rituals were woven into daily life. Offerings of food, tools, or crafted items were left at sacred sites or hearths. Festivals marked seasonal changes, honored ancestors, or sought protection for livestock and crops. Even seemingly small actions, lighting candles, reciting chants, or observing omens, were considered vital to survival. Ignoring these practices was dangerous in the eyes of the community. Shamans, seers, and elders acted as mediators between the mortal and spiritual realms. They advised on hunting, farming, childbirth, and conflict resolution. Their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies was often framed in spiritual terms, blending medicine with ritual. Communities relied on them to interpret signs, predict weather, and guide critical decisions. Belief systems also reinforced social cohesion. Shared rituals and ceremonies strengthened bonds, fostered loyalty, and maintained order within villages. Fear of spiritual consequences ensured adherence to rules, discouraging theft, laziness, or reckless behavior. Faith was both a psychological and practical tool for survival. Even in moments of extreme hardship, religion provided guidance. A family facing winter famine, illness, or a predator attack might pray for protection or interpret omens to make strategic decisions. Spiritual practices offered structure and focus in a chaotic world, helping villagers endure stress and uncertainty. However, belief could be a double-edged sword. Misinterpretation of omens, failure to appease spirits, or suspicion of witchcraft could spark conflict, ostracism, or violence. Villagers needed discernment, courage, and flexibility, balancing faith with practical knowledge. In medieval Scandinavia, survival was not purely physical. Spiritual awareness, adherence to tradition, and respect for the unseen forces were as critical as fire, food, or weapons. Faith shaped decisions, behavior, and strategies for enduring life's relentless dangers. Without it, or without understanding its role in the community, a villager's chance of surviving even a single day was sharply reduced. In medieval Scandinavia, winter made raids even deadlier. Snow and ice complicated travel, but it also provided cover for attackers, allowing raiders to move silently across frozen landscapes. The cold amplified danger. A village could survive a brief assault in summer, but in winter, the same attack could be catastrophic. Villages fortified longhouses with additional barriers, but snowdrifts and ice often undermined defenses. Raiders exploited terrain, approaching from frozen rivers, concealed valleys, or dense forests. Their movements were strategic, they struck when the village was most vulnerable, often at dawn or during storms. Surprise was their greatest weapon. Inside the longhouse, inhabitants were tense and alert. Watch shifts became more rigorous. Families huddled near fires, weapons within reach, listening for the slightest unusual sound. A misstep, a creaking roof, a door left ajar, or a child crying, could betray the village's position. The cold made movement slower and more exhausting, yet vigilance could not lapse. Raiding parties targeted food, livestock, and weapons, but sometimes their aim was psychological: instill fear, weaken morale, or assert dominance. Fires were set to destroy supplies, livestock pens were torn open, and raiders took captives. Children, elders, and those unable to fight were especially at risk. The frigid temperatures outside meant that escape from the longhouse without fire or clothing was often fatal. Defending a village required coordination. Men formed lines at entrances, women and older children reinforced barricades, and some villagers created diversions to protect key resources. Even with careful planning, casualties were common. The cold exacerbated injuries, and blood loss or frostbite could kill quickly. Winter raids combined human violence with nature's lethality. After the attack, survivors faced grim choices. Fires had to be extinguished, bodies recovered, and the wounded cared for. Food stores were often depleted, intensifying hunger. The psychological toll was severe. The knowledge that raiders could return at any time created constant anxiety. Villagers learned to rebuild quickly, repair defenses, and maintain vigilance, but each raid left communities weakened and more vulnerable. For a modern person, the combination of winter's harshness and human hostility is unimaginable. Surviving a raid required not only strength and skill but also strategy, endurance, and constant attention. Even a single day in such a world demanded a level of resilience few could endure. In medieval Scandinavia, winter raids were not isolated events, they were part of life. Every village, family, and individual existed under the shadow of potential attack, where the cold amplified every danger, and survival depended on preparation, courage, and luck. In medieval Scandinavia, death was never distant, it was part of daily life. Villagers faced threats from cold, starvation, disease, predators, and human violence. Families lost members frequently, often without warning, and mourning was both a personal and communal challenge. When death occurred, it disrupted the entire household. Survivors had to care for the wounded, protect livestock, repair buildings, and maintain the fire, all while processing grief. There was no time for prolonged mourning. Survival demanded action. Children observed these rituals, learning that loss was constant and resilience mandatory. Funeral rites were deeply symbolic. Bodies were often cremated or buried, accompanied by offerings, prayers, and ceremonies to honor the deceased and ensure safe passage to the afterlife. Belief in gods and spirits guided practices, with the hope that appeasing the dead or divine entities could protect the living. These rituals reinforced social bonds and transmitted cultural values, even amidst danger. The emotional toll of frequent death shaped behavior and social structures. Communities prioritized protection, food security, and alliances to minimize losses. Fear of death drove vigilance, cooperation, and skill development. Children learned to respect the dangers around them, from hunting hazards to potential raids, understanding that one careless moment could be fatal. Mourning also served practical purposes. Knowledge of how and why individuals died informed survival strategies. Families learned to recognize signs of disease, weaknesses in defenses, and environmental risks. Each death became a lesson, however painful, ensuring that the living adapted to reduce their own chances of dying. In addition, death influenced hierarchy and inheritance. Property, tools, and land were passed down, often shifting social standing. Thralls had no inheritance, while freemen and leaders could see fortunes and responsibilities change abruptly after a death. Understanding these dynamics was essential for social survival, not just physical survival. In medieval Scandinavia, life and death were tightly intertwined. Every day carried risk, and the community's resilience depended on how well it adapted to loss. Even surviving a single day required constant vigilance, skill, and an understanding of mortality. The fragility of life shaped culture, behavior, and every aspect of daily existence. By now, you understand the stark truth: life in medieval Scandinavia was a relentless struggle. Every day tested endurance, skill, and resolve. From brutal winters to disease, raids, predators, and the constant threat of hunger, villagers existed in a world where death was never far away. Survival required more than strength, it demanded vigilance, cunning, and a deep understanding of both nature and human behavior. Every aspect of life was tied to survival. Longhouses were shelters, fortresses, and centers of social structure. Tools and craftsmanship determined whether a villager could secure firewood, repair clothing, or defend against predators. Hunting, fishing, and foraging were constant battles against both environment and wildlife. Children learned from birth that survival was earned through skill and awareness. Human threats were just as deadly. Raids, feuds, and the constant pressure of social hierarchy shaped daily behavior. Success depended not only on physical ability but also on social acumen, alliances, loyalty, and strategy often mattered as much as swords or spears. Every miscalculation could be fatal. The cold and isolation amplified all dangers. Winter brought starvation, frostbite, and deadly exposure. Disease and injury could strike at any moment, and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. Faith and rituals provided guidance and psychological support, but they could not replace skill, preparation, or alertness. Survival was a community effort. Families, neighbors, and clans depended on cooperation, knowledge sharing, and collective vigilance. Yet even the strongest bonds could not guarantee safety. The world was unpredictable and harsh, only those who adapted quickly, learned from every threat, and respected the rules of nature and society endured. For a modern person, even imagining a single day in this environment is daunting. Every moment required decision-making under life or death pressure. Every task, gathering firewood, tending livestock, cooking, repairing the longhouse, could be fatal if mishandled. Comfort, security, and predictability did not exist, existence itself was a constant negotiation with death. And so, medieval Scandinavia was not a world for the faint-hearted. Its beauty, culture, and community life existed alongside extreme danger. To live, even for a single day, demanded courage, skill, endurance, and a relentless focus on survival. Those who succeeded were not merely lucky, they were warriors against nature, humans, and the unforgiving climate. Those who failed did not survive to tell the tale. You would not last a day there.